Welcome to the note presentation for Chapter 11, Section 1, The Work of Gregor Mendel. Remember to fill in your notes for Section 11.1 as you listen to this presentation. And don't forget that you can pause this presentation as needed to make sure that you complete those notes. So let's get going. All right, the learning objectives for this lesson are as follows. There are 4 of them. The first one is to describe how Mendel studied inheritance in peas. Then we're going to summarize Mendel's conclusion about inheritance. We're going to explain the principles of dominance. And we're going to describe what happens during segregation. Okay, make sure you have all those written down. And on we go. So Gregor Mendel's peas, okay. This guy named Gregor Mendel, he knew that what we now call genetics is the scientific study of heredity. And he started out as a monk in Austria. So he was an Austrian monk, and his work was extremely important to the understanding of heredity and how it works. Mendel carried out his work with ordinary garden peas. So he had a garden back behind his house, and he would grow peas, and he figured out that there was a lot of different peas that they looked different from each other, and he wanted to know why. So he kind of started experimenting. So when he started this, he already knew that the male part of each flower produces pollen containing sperm. So that's these parts right here that kind of stick out here. Those are the male parts. And then the female part of the flower produces the eggs. And that's the part in the middle here. Okay, kind of sticks down in here. So he already knew that. He knew that these parts had the pollen and that these parts had the egg, and that during sexual reproduction, that these sperm cells joined up with the egg cells in a process called fertilization. And what happens during fertilization, which you might already know, is that it produces a new cell. So we've already talked about how cells come from existing cells, and this is during fertilization this happens. So these old these parts come together, uh, the sperm cells and the egg cells, and they form a new cell during fertilization. These types of flowers, these pea flowers, these are what are called self-pollinating. That means that they have both the male parts and the female parts, and they can pollinate themselves. They don't need the assistance of bees or anything like that to help them pollinate. So they were a really easy plant to use in this process. So what Mendel had is he had these true breeding pea plants that if they were allowed to continually self-pollinate, that they would produce their offspring, their new plants that continue to grow would be identical. So if they had tall plants, they would continue to be tall. If they had short plants, they would continue to be short. So what he wanted to know is what would happen if you took the pollen from one plant and put it into the plant of another one. So he cross-pollinated. So he took the pollen from one plant with one characteristic and put it into another one to see what would happen. So he was able to produce seeds that had 2 different parents. Now, when we're talking about genes and traits, a trait is a specific characteristic that varies from one individual to another. So, whereas you might have brown eyes, somebody else in the classroom might have blue eyes, and these are traits. They vary from individual to another. When Mendel was studying his pea plants, he studied that there were 7 different pea plant traits that he studied, each with 2 contrasting characteristics. And what he did is he crossed the plants with each of the 7 contrasting characteristics and studied their offspring. So when he started looking at this is kind of how he termed it, he classified it. Each pair of plants, original plants, is called the P, or the parental generation. Then the offspring that those plants create are called the F1, or the first filial generation. The offspring of crosses between a parent with different traits are called hybrids. So essentially, he was creating a hybrid pea plant. So here's some of the traits that he was looking at. He was looking at seed shape, seed color, seed coat color, pod shape. And what he found was if he had a round and a wrinkled plant, or the seed, that the offspring generation, that first filial, would always be round. If he crossed a true breeding yellow seed color with a true breeding green seed color, he would always get yellow. If he crossed a gray seed color coat and with a white seed coat color, he would always get gray. And when he crossed a smooth pod with a constricted pod, he would always get the smooth pod. And then the final three were pod color, flower position, and plant height. So for the pod color, if he crossed a green pod with a yellow pod, he always got a green pod. If he crossed the flower position with axial, being kind of in the middle, and terminal, being at the top, he always got the axial position. And if he got a tall plant versus a short plant, he always got the tall plants. And what he figured out were that all of these must be what he called a dominant characteristic. So his first conclusion was that biological inheritance, what we inherit from our parents, is determined by factors that are passed from one generation to the next. Today, when we think about those things, scientists call those factors genes. We know that the genes that we get come from our parents, and that's because all the way back to Mendel when he did this work with the pea plants. So each of the traits that Mendel studied was controlled by one gene that occurred in two contrasting forms that produced different characters for each trait. The different forms of a gene are called alleles. So the trait is tallness, and the allele is a tall or a short. The second conclusion that Mendel came up with was called the principle of dominance. And your first key concept question in your notes states, what is the principle of dominance? And the principle of dominance states that some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. Now what that means is that dominant traits always show up when they are present, and recessive traits just kind of hang out in the background and they wait until the right conditions and then they show themselves. And we'll talk about what that looks like here in a second. So if we go back to the crosses on these pea plants, okay, these, we know that all of these were dominant because they always showed up, okay? Always, 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 these were the seeds that showed up. So this is how he knows that they're dominant, because if this color is present, if this shape, if this color, if this pod shape, if they're all present, it always shows up, so those are considered dominant. Whereas the ones that kind of hang out in the background, these are the recessive traits, that they have to have two of them in order to be present in the traits. He wanted to see, now that he's done the parental generation with the first filial generation, he wanted to see what happens if you take that F1 generation and cross it with itself. So what happens if you take two of those generations and you cross them together to produce the F2 generation? And what he found was that the traits controlled by recessive alleles appeared in a 1/4 of the F2 plants. So in 1/4 of the time, a quarter of the time, those recessive alleles, they started showing back up when he started crossing those F1 generations. And this is what that looks like. So here's the parent generation. In the parent generation, we have a tall plant and a short plant. Now we already know that the tall plant is going to be dominant. So in that F1 generation, we get 2 tall plants. But what happens when we cross these 2 tall plants together? And what he would find is that 3 times out of the 4, he would get tall plants, but then that 4th time, one of those 4 times we would get a short plant. So that short generation kind of jumped a little bit, that short trait. So that would show up later down the line. And what he figured out was that the reappearance of the trait controlled by that recessive allele had indicated that at some point the allele for shortness had been separated or segregated from the allele for tallness. So they did not always travel together. He figured out that at some point they get segregated from each other. What he suggested at this point was that the allele for tallness and shortness in the F1 plant segregated from each other during the formation of the sex cells, or what we know as gametes. So this is when those alleles start to separate from each other, and then they join back up to produce the offspring, and it looks like this. So if we have that F1 generation where we have all of the tall and the short, those 2 alleles, they separate from each other. Okay, so that's the segregation. So we take these and they get separated, and then these combine together to give us our new combination of our F2 generation. So where up here we have the tall and the tall, down here we have tall, 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 short, because that dominant tall gene is no longer present. All right, let's do a little bit of learning rejective review here before we finish up. How did Mendel study the inheritance in peas? Remember, this is not going to be on screen, so you will need to write it down as I talk about it or go back from your notes to get it. So Mendel studied the inheritance in peas by studying the 7 pea plant traits, each with 2 contrasting characteristics. He crossed plants with contrasting characters and studied their offspring. What did Mendel conclude about inheritance? He concluded that biological inheritance is determined by factors passed from one generation to the next. What is the principle of dominance? The principle of dominance says that some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. And lastly, what happens during segregation? During segregation, alleles separate during gamete formation. Okay, this is the end of the presentation for 11.1. Make sure you have all pages of the notes for 11.1 complete before we put them in your notebook. Go back and rewind if you need to. Pause, get all the information so everything is complete. See you next time.